Hi, welcome back students. This is Mr. Royer. Today we're going to be taking a look at how children develop socially and emotionally in early childhood. This is a lesson that is going to align with your textbook, Myers, Module 45. Our essential question today is how do children develop emotionally and socially? Animal experiments are going to illustrate the importance of emotional attachment in infancy. And we're going to take a look at how this translates into human attachment. Human attachment does appear to follow a similar process. Problems with attachment in infancy and early childhood are often associated with developmental problems later in life. So what is attachment? Attachment's an emotional tie that we develop with another person. It's demonstrated in young children with their seeking out familiarity and closeness to their caregivers. And they'll also show distress in separation. This is actually a normal part of human development, and when we're allowed to bond emotionally and attach to a primary caregiver, it gives us a sense of security about the world around us. Familiarity breeds the attachment, and this can occur during critical periods of development. A critical period is the optimal period shortly after birth when an organism's exposure to certain stimuli or experience produces proper development. And in the case of attachment, it really is all about early childhood. In the animal kingdom, there's a concept known as imprinting, a process by which certain animals form immediate attachments during a critical period early in life. In birds, for example, this imprinting occurs within hours of hatching. Konrad Lorenz was the first one to discover this. He was doing research on his farm where he was hatching out geese and those baby goslings. Then, because he was the one that was there when they hatched, began to follow him around instead of their mother. This concept, Lorenz determined, occurred anytime the goslings had the opportunity to attach emotionally 12 to 17 hours after birth. So whoever was around 12 to 17 hours after hatching became mom, and the goslings would follow them around just like a mother. This imprinting process is very obvious in animals. It's not quite as obvious in humans and other primates, but Harry Harlow and his monkey experiments did demonstrate that attachment plays a role in humans and human primates. Remember this experiment from earlier in the course. Harlow was experimenting as whether or not the monkey would prefer the terry cloth covered mother or the mother that provided the feeding. As it turns out, the infants would go to the wire mother just to get food, but would immediately return to the cloth mother for general security and attachment. If they were deprived of attachment, these infants would show psychological damage. They would be withdrawn, frightened, and in extreme cases, they were unable to communicate with their peers. They would cower in fright or act extremely aggressively. Most of them had difficulty mating in adulthood, and when they did, the mothers were completely unresponsive parents to their infants. They practically ignored them. So this makes us wonder, is there a connection between antisocial behaviors in humans and a lack of childhood attachment? As it turns out, based on research, which we'll discuss here in a moment, there are actual critical periods of development for human attachment. Human attachment occurs in at least 4 phases. An asocial phase is the first couple of weeks, where really the infants haven't quite fixated yet on what it is to socialize with others and inanimate objects. They do tend to prefer faces, as we discussed in our previous video, but they don't have an actual socialization yet. An indiscriminate attachment forms somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks and lasts up to about 6 months. An indiscriminate attachment means they prefer humans over inanimate objects, but they're not too picky about who it is. So if it's mom, dad, grandma, babysitter, they don't really care as long as somebody's attending to their needs. But around 6 to 11 months, the single discriminate attachment occurs. A discriminate attachment is a strong bond to a single caregiver. That caregiver, in many cases traditionally, was mothers. But it is not always the mother. And in some cases, moms get pretty upset when a child actually attaches to another caregiver. Multiple attachments begin then around 11 to 12 months of age. This is where the child begins to strongly bond or attach to more than one caregiver. Now, it's during this period of emotional development and attachment where children will start to exhibit strong stranger anxieties. In that time period, during the discriminate attachment phase in particular, 6 to 11 months, babies are extremely anxious around strangers. This fear of strangers has an innate evolutionary sense. It was a survival strategy. Separation anxiety is an extension of this stranger anxiety. It's an absolute distress, emotional distress, the infant experiences when they're separated from that primary caregiver. It is a strong response to their caregiver leaving. The separation anxiety tends to peak out somewhere around 13 months. You can see the data here on the right about the percentage of infants who cried when their primary caregiver, in this case mothers, left. And then you can see that it tends to start to diminish after 13 months. So as a babysitter, when the call comes to come babysit that 12 or 13-month-old, you may want to think twice. Now, there are several different types of human attachment. This research was based on experiments done by Dr. Mary Ainsworth, known as the Strange Situation Experiments. We'll be watching some of the clips from these experiments in class. Under this scenario, they would basically put infants in different scenario situations where the mother would leave and another researcher would come in and try to interact with the child. Children would exhibit various types of attachment based upon these situations, and depending on how strong their attachment was to the primary caregiver. The research was compiled in conjunction with John Bowlby, who is another English psychologist who first developed this idea of different attachment styles. Combining Bowlby and Ainsworth's research, we can come up with at least 3 different types of attachment: secure attachments, anxious and avoidant attachments, and anxious ambivalent attachments. So let's take a look at these 3, and then a 4th one that is sometimes just referred to as disorganized. When a child's reaction to the mother's leaving is securely attached, they're going to balance the need to explore with the need to be close. They tend to welcome the mother back when she returns. That is their reaction upon return. And they don't really express much anger. So the securely attached or emotionally secure child is okay with mom leaving. Maybe a little tiny bit anxious, but she's very happy when she comes back and they're not angry. Avoidant attachment ignores or avoids the mother when the mother leaves. And they ignore or avoid the mother when she returns. We don't really know if the child is angry or not because they don't express anything. The resistant attachment style, the child's not upset at the mother's departure, but they reject the mother when she returns, and there's a great deal of anger. Disorganized attachment, of course, would be variable. That doesn't fit into these other categories. As it turns out, at this point we've been talking primarily about the primary caregiver, and we tend to think of that as mothers. But dads matter too. And dads are just more than mobile sperm banks. In fact, we now understand that fathers play an integral role in creating a secure attachment for children. Paternal separation puts children at increased risk for all sorts of psychological and social pathologies later in life. Children who are absent secure attachments to both parents seem to have more difficulties. Daycare is also a concern for many parents who need to use daycare to return to work. Does daycare harm children in their emotional development? Now, as it turns out, based on high studies, if you have a good quality daycare situation, there's no detrimental effect on children over the age of 2. Prior to the age of 2, it's less clear, but it largely depends upon the level of attachment. When a child is securely attached, they seem to transition better into daycare situations. So secure attachment does predict social competence later in life. Children who are abused, neglected, are much more likely to have social and emotional problems. We can see very strong evidence for this in the Romanian orphanages from the 1990s. Severe psychological and emotional disturbances were associated with these children many years later, when thousands of these children had to be reared in orphanages, state-run orphanages, at a ratio of 15 to 1. Under those kinds of situations and environments, infants did not receive enough attention, and they were not held enough. Yes, they were fed, yes, their diapers were changed, but that was about it. And these children showed what happens when that attachment does not occur. Child rearing styles also play a role. There's a couple of different parenting styles, and one parenting style in particular has a positive correlational effect on a developing child's self-concept. We can classify child rearing practices into 4 different styles. Style 1 is the authoritarian. The authoritarian imposes rules and expects absolute obedience all the time. They are demanding, but not necessarily responsive to the child's needs. These are parents that essentially say, "Why? Because I said so." There's no discussion. Authoritarian parenting, by the way, may work in small children, but is still not the most effective parenting style. Permissive parents are the complete opposite. These are parents that tend to submit to every one of their child's desires, making very few demands on them, setting very few limits, and using virtually no punishments. Authoritative parents are both demanding but also responsive to the needs of their children. They do exert control by setting rules and boundaries, but they also explain the reasoning behind these rules, and they encourage open discussion in changing the rules when appropriate. So this is a more democratic style of parenting, but still requiring limits. And then there's the neglectful or uninvolved parent. These are parents that are neither attentive nor demanding, and they essentially allow their children to raise themselves. They have no appropriate rules or guidelines and often feel rejected and emotionally distant. So we can put these 4 parenting styles into a matrix, and this may help you remember them a little bit better. So let's just look at it from a standpoint of, are the parents demanding? Do they expect the child to maintain certain rules? Or are they undemanding and they have no expectations? Are they supportive, meaning they're child-centered, they are responsive to their children's needs? Or are they unsupportive, where they reject them and are much more parent-centered and ignore the children? If you have a situation where you have an unsupportive, undemanding parent, that's our rejecting, neglecting parent. And this is by far the worst scenario for children because they have no opportunity to attach. In the case of an unsupportive parent who is still very demanding, we have that authoritarian. This is the way it has to be done. It's my rules, my way or the highway. If you have an undemanding parent who's supportive, they're too permissive. They are child-centered and they want to cater their children's needs, but they don't want to place any limits on them. This is the parent that wants to be their children's friends. Your children have enough friends. They don't need their parent to be a friend. They need their parents to be parents and offer guidance. And that's where the authoritative parenting comes in. Authoritative parenting is supportive and demanding. There are rules. There have to be. Children do need guidelines. They can't raise themselves. But the relationship is reciprocal. It's responsive. It's bidirectional in terms of communication. And as a child grows, we adjust and change to their responsibility and level of trust. So when we're talking about a child's developing self-concept, we're talking about their sense of identity and self-worth. When does it begin? It starts immediately. And that's why understanding these early concepts in attachment and social development are so important. Positive view of self-worth can be fostered by parents through secure attachment, authoritative parenting, and unconditional positive regard for your child. In other words, showing your child that you love them, you're there to help them, and you love them no matter what. In our next lesson, we're going to start to explore adolescence. We're going to begin by looking at all of the changes that we go through in puberty and our burgeoning sexual development. Until then, have a great day.